Lieutenant Emma Carter stared at the boarding pass in her hand as she made her way through the busy airport terminal, the noise and rush of people a sharp contrast to the quiet intensity she had become used to. Just last night, she had left the arid, dust-filled base in the Middle East, boarding a military transport jet with other service members. Now, she was finally headed back to the U.S., each step bringing her closer to the life she had left behind 6 long months ago. Her body still felt the weight of the combat gear, though now she was dressed in her uniform, the patches and insignia marking her rank and branch for anyone who cared to notice. The airport felt overwhelming, bright lights, the mix of dozens of voices, music playing softly over the intercoms. She took a deep breath, grounding herself. Soon, she'd be back in her hometown, where her parents and younger sister had planned a surprise homecoming dinner. Well, not exactly a surprise. Her mom wasn't very good at keeping secrets. But before that, Emma had a flight to catch. Her thoughts were interrupted by the crackle of the intercom. Now boarding first class for Flight 163 to Boston. First-class passengers are welcome to board at this time. Emma's brow furrowed in surprise. She glanced at her ticket, confirming that, yes, she did have a first-class seat. She hadn't booked it herself. Soldiers weren't usually granted such luxuries. Perhaps it was a last-minute upgrade, or maybe one of those rare, kind-hearted gestures from an airline worker who saw her rank and thought she deserved a small treat. Either way, Emma wasn't about to question it. She shrugged, tugging her bag onto her shoulder and making her way to the gate. As she boarded, her well-worn combat boots thudded against the jet bridge. In her uniform, she stood out sharply among the business suits, vacation shorts, and t-shirts. She walked into the first-class cabin, which was awash in polished chrome and leather. The seats were large and plush, inviting relaxation, a far cry from the hard benches and cramped spaces of military transport planes. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," a flight attendant greeted her with a warm smile. "Your seat is 2A, just to your left." "Thank you," Emma replied, nodding politely as she made her way to the seat. She placed her backpack in the overhead bin and settled into the large, comfortable chair, a quiet sigh of relief escaping her. This small comfort felt almost strange. She had grown so accustomed to discomfort that sitting in a soft seat with ample legroom felt nearly unreal. As other passengers began to file in, Emma leaned back and closed her eyes. She could feel her shoulders relax as the familiar background noises of boarding filled the cabin. The scrape of luggage wheels, the low hum of conversations, and the steady rhythm of footsteps. She let her mind drift, touching lightly on the memories of her recent deployment. Though she tried to keep her mind on the joy of seeing her family soon, scenes from the field flickered in her mind. Sandy landscapes, her team's voices, the intense focus required at every moment. "Excuse me," a sharp voice interrupted her moment of peace. Emma's eyes snapped open. A man, perhaps in his early 50s, stood in the aisle beside her, staring down at her with a look of thinly veiled disdain. "I believe you're in my seat," he stated, each word clipped and precise. Emma blinked, slightly taken aback. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is the seat assigned to me." She reached for her boarding pass to double-check, though she knew very well she hadn't made a mistake. The man's eyes raked over her, pausing on her uniform. His gaze shifted, a subtle disdain hardening in his features. "There must be some mistake," he replied, his tone leaving little room for discussion. "This is first class." Emma felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. The look in his eyes was not unfamiliar, though it didn't make it any easier to face. She could feel the heat of embarrassment creep into her cheeks, but she maintained her composure, her voice steady as she replied, "Yes, sir, I know. My boarding pass is for this seat, 2A." She held it out, hoping the visual proof would put an end to the discussion. The man barely glanced at the boarding pass before calling out to a nearby flight attendant, who quickly made her way over with a calm, practiced smile. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between Emma and the man with a polite but probing gaze. "Yes," the man said, his voice growing louder. "This person claims to have a first-class ticket, but surely there's been a mistake. I paid for a first-class ticket, and I'd like to have my seat." Emma felt the eyes of other passengers on her, a ripple of discomfort and curiosity spreading through the cabin. She kept her expression neutral, though a flicker of anger sparked within her. She wasn't about to let this man rattle her. The flight attendant took Emma's boarding pass, scrutinizing it with a trained eye. She nodded, then turned back to the man. "Sir, Lieutenant Carter is indeed assigned to seat 2A. Everything appears to be in order." The man's face flushed, a deep red that crept up his neck and cheeks. He opened his mouth as if to protest but stopped himself, letting out a huff of annoyance instead. "This is unacceptable," he muttered, his voice low but still loud enough for Emma to hear. He shot her one last glare before storming off down the aisle, grumbling as he went. Emma took a deep breath, willing her heart rate to slow. The quiet hum of other conversations resumed, but she could still feel the lingering glances from nearby passengers. She tried to focus on her breathing, calming herself as she had learned to do under pressure. This was just one more test of her strength, she told herself. Just another challenge in a long line of them. As the flight attendants began preparing for takeoff, Emma's thoughts wandered back to the man's expression, the look in his eyes, the tone in his voice. She knew prejudice when she saw it, and this wasn't the first time she'd been judged for wearing her uniform in spaces where people assumed she didn't belong. And yet, there was something different about this encounter. For all her strength and training, she couldn't shake the heaviness that settled over her. After a few moments, the flight attendant returned, offering her a sympathetic smile. "I'm so sorry about that, Lieutenant Carter," she said quietly. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" Emma shook her head, managing a polite smile. "No, thank you. I'm fine." As the plane taxied to the runway, Emma gazed out the window, watching the airport bustle fade into the distance. She thought about her family, waiting for her at the other end of this flight, and the joy of reuniting with them soon. She focused on that image, letting it soothe the tension from the confrontation. Soon, she would be home, surrounded by the people who understood and loved her without judgment. And that, she reminded herself, was all that truly mattered. Emma settled into the plush first-class seat, still a little stunned by the unexpected upgrade. She had been mentally prepared for the typical cramped, economy class, and being here felt almost surreal. As she leaned back, taking in her surroundings, a quiet gratitude filled her. This small luxury was a welcome reprieve from the long, hard months she had spent overseas, where comfort was a concept as foreign as a peaceful night's sleep. The other first-class passengers continued to file in, mostly dressed in business attire, carrying briefcases and designer handbags. She could feel their eyes on her, a subtle awareness prickling her senses. She was, after all, an anomaly here, her fatigues marking her as an outsider in this world of suits and sophistication. Emma adjusted her posture, straightening her shoulders, letting her expression remain neutral and composed. She had earned this seat, she told herself, even if it was by chance. A flight attendant approached, bending slightly to meet her at eye level. "Thank you for your service, Lieutenant Carter," she said with a genuine smile. "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Emma replied, her tone softening. Small gestures of appreciation like these meant more to her than she usually let on. After months of feeling invisible or even disregarded on deployment, where the focus was strictly on duty, it was nice to be seen as a person again. As she watched other passengers stow their belongings and settle in, her mind began to drift. Her family would be waiting at the airport, probably with a handmade sign her little sister had crafted, decorated with American flags and glitter, knowing her. And her mom? Oh, her mom would cry the moment she saw Emma. The thought made Emma's heart swell, a warmth she could hold on to through the thick and thin of her days. But just as she closed her eyes, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me," a voice said, firm and irritated. Emma opened her eyes to see a young woman, neatly dressed in a business suit, standing next to her seat with an expression of mild confusion. Emma blinked, realizing that the woman wasn't looking at her, but at the seat directly across the aisle. Another uniformed soldier, a man who looked just as out of place in first class as Emma herself, was slinging his oversized rucksack into the overhead compartment. He turned to the young woman, a slight, sheepish grin on his face. "Oh, sorry about that," he said, moving quickly to rearrange his bag so it didn't intrude on her space. "I'll move it over here." The young woman gave a stiff nod, her eyes flicking from the soldier to Emma. She didn't say anything, but Emma could see the subtle question in her gaze, as if wondering how it was possible that two soldiers had ended up in first class. The soldier across the aisle caught Emma's eye and gave her a slight nod of solidarity. She returned it, grateful to see someone else who understood. The flight attendant moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts, and the hum of the engines increased. Emma took one last deep breath, letting the noise and movement wash over her, grounding herself in the simple fact that she was on her way home. As the plane took off, Emma closed her eyes, feeling the familiar rumble beneath her feet as they climbed higher and higher. She settled back, feeling her shoulders relax as the pressure of takeoff turned into a steady hum. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel the reality of her situation. She was going home. Soon, she'd be surrounded by the voices, faces, and laughter of her family. But her peace was interrupted once more by a familiar voice, sharper this time. "Excuse me," came the curt voice from the aisle. Emma's eyes opened, and she saw the man from before, the one who had claimed she'd taken his seat. He stood beside her, irritation etched deeply into his features, his gaze fixed on her with a strange mixture of disbelief and disdain. Emma straightened, her expression neutral but guarded. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone professional. The man folded his arms, shaking his head slightly. "I'm sorry, but I still don't understand how someone like you ended up here in first class," he said, his voice just loud enough to carry over the nearby rows. "This is a premium seat, and I paid good money for mine." Emma felt her jaw tighten, but maintained her composure. "I understand, sir," she said, her voice calm. "I don't know the reason for the upgrade myself. I'm just following the boarding instructions on my ticket." A few other passengers turned to watch, their expressions varying from mild curiosity to discomfort. Emma noticed a young couple in the row behind her exchange a look, but she tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the man in front of her. His expression didn't soften. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "I expect a certain level of decorum in first class, and it's surprising to see the standards slipping." Before Emma could respond, the flight attendant appeared at her side, her smile steady and unwavering. "Is there something I can assist you with, sir?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. The man turned to her, his expression souring further. "Yes, there certainly is. I've already spoken with you once about this. I expect to fly in an environment of professionalism, not in a space that's becoming overrun." The flight attendant's expression didn't falter. She looked him squarely in the eyes, her voice still even and controlled. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to keep your voice down. Lieutenant Carter is a paying passenger, just as you are, and she has every right to be here." She gave him a pointed look, one that left little room for argument. "Now, if you don't have any further questions, we ask that you please return to your seats so we can continue with our in-flight preparations." Emma felt a wave of gratitude toward the flight attendant, who hadn't wavered even under the man's sharp gaze. The man, clearly flustered, muttered something under his breath, his gaze narrowing as he gave Emma one last scowl. Then, with a huff, he turned and marched back to his seat. The flight attendant turned to Emma, her expression softening. "I'm so sorry about that, Lieutenant," she said in a lower voice, genuine sympathy in her tone. "Some people just don't understand." "It's all right," Emma replied, giving her a small nod. "Thank you for handling that." The flight attendant smiled, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder before moving down the aisle to check on the other passengers. Emma took a deep breath, feeling her shoulders relax again, but a faint sense of unease lingered. She had faced prejudice before, both subtle and overt, in spaces where her presence wasn't expected or welcomed. Yet somehow, every encounter still left her feeling unsettled, a reminder of how far society still had to go. Once the commotion settled down, Emma looked around, observing the cabin, the low hum of voices, the clinking of glasses as the flight attendants began distributing drinks. She took a moment to remind herself why she was here, why she wore the uniform. The freedom and safety she fought for back in the Middle East didn't come easily. It required sacrifice, dedication, and, sometimes, moments like this, where she had to stand tall, even in the face of unwarranted scrutiny. As the flight attendant returned, she offered Emma a water bottle with a small smile. Emma accepted it with gratitude, giving her a brief nod of thanks before taking a sip and turning her gaze out the window. The clouds stretched out in endless white waves beneath them, serene and boundless. The tension of the moment began to melt away as Emma looked forward to the hours ahead. Soon, she reminded herself, she would be back on solid ground, reunited with the people who truly mattered. And in the grand scheme of things, a little discomfort was nothing compared to what she'd already been through. Her thoughts drifted, and gradually, the hum of the engines, the quiet clinking of ice, and the steady rise of altitude became a lullaby. Emma leaned back, closing her eyes, letting herself imagine the first embrace with her family waiting for her in Boston. Emma had finally found a moment of peace. The tension from the encounter with the man earlier was beginning to fade, her heartbeat returning to its steady rhythm. She watched the clouds drift past her window, letting the hum of the engine soothe her. But just as she began to relax, she heard the distinct sound of approaching footsteps, stopping right next to her seat. "Excuse me." Emma turned, finding herself face to face with the man from earlier. His expression was sharper now, his lips drawn into a thin line of displeasure. "Yes," she replied, her voice neutral, carefully keeping her tone steady. The man didn't seem fazed by her calmness. If anything, it seemed to agitate him further. "I thought I'd made it clear earlier," he began, his voice tight with irritation. "This is first class, not a charity handout." Emma's expression didn't change, though inside, she could feel her patience wearing thin. She looked him in the eye, forcing herself to remain composed. "Sir, I assure you, I'm in the right seat." The man let out an exasperated sigh. "Look, I paid good money for my seat. First class has certain standards, and I expect to travel among people who belong." The implication hit Emma like a slap. She'd heard similar remarks before, veiled in different ways, but always carrying the same sting. Her presence in first class, in her military uniform, somehow didn't meet his standards. She felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her response measured. "I serve my country, sir, and I'm on my way home, just like you." For a brief second, a flicker of uncertainty passed over the man's face, but he quickly shook it off. "There's no need to bring that into this," he replied, his tone defensive. "I just want a peaceful flight, without disruptions." Emma was about to respond when the flight attendant returned, her polite smile now replaced with a more determined look. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, glancing between Emma and the man. The man folded his arms, visibly irritated. "No, everything is not all right. I'm questioning why someone, like her, is even here." The flight attendant's gaze hardened, her calm professionalism unwavering. "Sir, Lieutenant Carter has every right to be here, just as you do. If you have any further concerns, I would ask that you return to your seat. We are about to begin our in-flight service." The man opened his mouth to argue but then stopped, realizing he was outnumbered. With a final glare at Emma, he spun around and stalked off toward his seat. The flight attendant turned back to Emma, her expression softening. "I apologize for that, Lieutenant. Some people just can't seem to understand." Emma gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I appreciate your support." "Of course," the flight attendant replied, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder before moving down the aisle. Emma took a deep breath, letting the moment pass, reminding herself that she had faced far greater challenges than one man's prejudice. As she watched the flight attendants prepare for the meal service, Emma's mind wandered back to the field, to the faces and names of the comrades she had served alongside. She had fought and trained with people from every background and walk of life. They had formed bonds that transcended race, class, or any label that could be thrown at them. And it was those bonds, that unity, that had allowed them to face some of the toughest moments of their lives together. As the meal service began, Emma leaned back, sipping the water the flight attendant had brought her, letting herself get lost in the quiet murmur of passengers and the faint clinking of cutlery. Despite the earlier encounter, she tried to stay focused on the excitement of her journey home, envisioning her family's smiling faces. She didn't want one unpleasant man to ruin her trip. but she could still feel the lingering stares from nearby passengers, their glances quick but unmistakable. Some looked away the moment her eyes met theirs, others continued watching, their expressions unreadable. She felt a mixture of emotions, embarrassment, irritation, and a dull ache of disappointment. She had expected that her journey home would be joyful, filled with thoughts of reunion, not marred by silent judgments from strangers who didn't know her. Emma tried to push it from her mind, focusing instead on her surroundings. She looked around, observing the other passengers and imagining their stories. There was a young couple across the aisle, their heads close together, sharing earbuds and laughing at something on their phone. An elderly woman sat a few rows up, her gaze fixed on a knitting project in her hands, completely unbothered by anything around her. These people were strangers, people she would never see again after the flight. But even so, their glances and silent judgments weighed on her. As she finished her drink, she felt a soft tap on her shoulder. She turned to find the elderly woman from earlier looking at her with a warm, gentle smile. "Dear," the woman said in a low voice, "don't let that man's behavior bother you. It says far more about him than it does about you." Emma felt a surge of gratitude for the stranger's kindness. She smiled, nodding appreciatively. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot." The woman nodded, her eyes kind. "I've seen plenty of people like him in my time. They think they're entitled to the world because of what's in their wallet. But respect is earned, not bought." Emma couldn't help but smile, the tension in her shoulders easing. This woman's words were exactly what she needed to hear. As the elderly woman returned to her knitting, Emma leaned back in her seat, feeling a renewed sense of calm. She focused on the hum of the plane and let herself drift into her thoughts, replaying moments from her deployment and the camaraderie she'd built with her fellow soldiers. They were the ones who truly understood her, and soon she would be home with the people who mattered most. The steady rhythm of the plane's engine lulled Emma into a half-dreaming state, her mind drifting back to memories from her recent deployment. The faces of her fellow soldiers filled her mind, familiar, steadfast, people she would trust with her life. She could see their faces clearly, each one marked by the same exhaustion, yet always ready to push forward. Emma's thoughts landed on her closest friend during her deployment, Sergeant Elena Torres, a fiery Latina from Texas with a spirit as fierce as her loyalty. The two of them had formed an unbreakable bond, their friendship forged in the fires of countless missions, long patrols, and endless nights under the foreign, starlit skies. She remembered how they would laugh to keep their spirits high, even when the reality of their situation bore down on them. A specific memory surfaced, one that still filled Emma with a mixture of awe and gratitude. It was a sweltering afternoon, and their convoy had been ambushed while moving supplies through a remote area. The gunfire was intense, a cacophony of chaos echoing across the barren landscape. Emma had taken cover behind a damaged vehicle, her pulse racing, when she heard a cry for help. It was Torres, pinned down and barely visible through the haze of dust and gunfire. Without a second thought, Emma had crawled over to her, braving the open field to reach her. Together, they managed to fend off the attackers, their combined strength and quick thinking the only things keeping them alive. In the heat of that moment, Emma had felt a sense of unity that went beyond words, a bond that transcended any divide. They were sisters, bound not by blood, but by shared struggle, sacrifice, and survival. As she sat in her first-class seat, Emma thought of Torres and the others, how they had come from all walks of life, each carrying different backgrounds and histories, yet finding common ground in their duty and determination. She remembered their shared laughter, the way they lifted each other up in the face of hardship, and how none of them cared about each other's backgrounds when it came down to the mission. It was that camaraderie that reminded her of what truly mattered. Here on this plane, she was a stranger to everyone, an object of misplaced judgment. But to her comrades, she was family. The bonds she'd forged in those difficult months overseas were unbreakable, immune to the prejudices and assumptions that existed in the normal world. As Emma relived these memories, her frustration with the man from earlier began to dissolve, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. She was more than the assumptions others made about her. She carried with her the pride, strength, and resilience of her service. Her experiences in the field had taught her that respect wasn't something you could demand from someone. It was something earned through action and integrity. And she would continue to carry herself with dignity, no matter where she went or who questioned her presence. Emma had just begun to drift into a peaceful sleep when the plane jolted suddenly, pulling her sharply back to the present. She opened her eyes, startled, as the seatbelt sign flickered on and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a bit of turbulence. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened." The plane shuddered again, and Emma felt the tension ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, and the once soft murmur of conversation faded into nervous silence. A few rose up, a mother struggled to calm her crying toddler, and to Emma's right, an elderly man gripped his armrest tightly, his knuckles white. For Emma, turbulence wasn't new. Her time in military transport flights had conditioned her to unexpected, bone-rattling motions that made commercial turbulence feel mild by comparison. Still, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as her instinct sharpened, a reflex born from months in high-stress situations. She took a deep breath, letting her training guide her. A flight attendant hurried past, her face calm but clearly focused, scanning the cabin for anyone in distress. Emma noticed the elderly woman she had spoken with earlier, the one who had defended her from the rude passenger, clutching her knitting tightly, her face pale. Emma leaned across the aisle, catching the woman's eye. "Ma'am, just take deep breaths. Turbulence is normal. We're safe." The woman met Emma's gaze, her eyes wide but grateful. "Thank you, dear. It's been years since I've flown, and I'd forgotten how unsettling it can be." Emma gave her a reassuring smile. "It's understandable, but I promise it's nothing to worry about." Her calm words seemed to soothe not only the elderly woman, but also a few nearby passengers who overheard. She glanced across the aisle and noticed the man from earlier, the one who had been so adamant about her not belonging in first class. He was watching her now, his expression surprisingly subdued. She wondered if he, too, felt uneasy or embarrassed by his behavior earlier. But she quickly pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the passengers around her. For the next several minutes, Emma stayed alert, offering a calm presence to those who seemed anxious, speaking softly to anyone who needed reassurance. The plane rocked a few more times before finally settling into a smoother path, the captain's voice coming on again to announce that they had moved past the rough patch. The seatbelt sign turned off, and the hum of conversation resumed, a few passengers letting out relieved sighs. Emma leaned back, satisfied that everyone around her seemed calmer. She had forgotten, for a brief moment, that she wasn't in uniform to serve these passengers. But it was simply second nature to her. Helping others, especially in moments of fear or uncertainty, was something she didn't turn off just because she was off duty. As she settled back into her seat, she couldn't help but notice that the man from earlier still seemed to be watching her. His gaze wasn't hostile now, though. There was something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe even the first traces of respect. The flight had smoothed out, but the energy of the cabin was still subdued, passengers returning to their conversations, some casting glances at Emma now and then. She caught the man from earlier studying her a few times. This time, his look wasn't one of disdain but rather an almost thoughtful expression, as if he were reassessing something he had taken for granted. Emma tried to ignore him, but his gaze followed her movements, lingering longer than she was comfortable with. She wondered if he was finally realizing how out of line he had been. The turbulence seemed to have shaken something in him besides fear. After a while, the man stood up and slowly walked over to her, stopping a few steps away as if he were unsure whether he should approach. Emma glanced up, slightly surprised. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Carter, right?" he began, his voice softer than she had heard it before. Well, I wanted to apologize." Emma blinked, taken aback. She hadn't expected an apology, especially not from him. She nodded, giving him a neutral look. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but cautious. The man's face softened a little. "You kept a lot of people calm back there," he continued, gesturing to the cabin around them. "Not everyone would do that. You seem to have a natural sense for this sort of thing." Emma nodded again, this time her expression a bit gentler. "It's part of my training," she replied simply. "In situations where others might panic, I've learned to stay calm and help when I can." The man shifted awkwardly, as if searching for the right words. I just wanted you to know that I appreciate what you did back there. For everyone." Emma watched him, sensing that he was struggling with something deeper than just discomfort from the turbulence. For a moment, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his gaze, a hint of something unspoken. "Well, I appreciate the apology," she replied, offering a small nod. "Everyone has moments they're not proud of. It takes courage to acknowledge them." The man's shoulders relaxed a little, and he gave her a hesitant nod in return. "Thank you," he murmured, before turning and heading back to his seat. Emma watched him go, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. She hadn't expected to earn his respect, but maybe, just maybe, she had managed to change his perspective, even just a little. With the turbulence past and the cabin at ease, Emma finally let herself relax. But her thoughts kept returning to the man's unexpected apology and to the strange, almost tense silence that had hung between them during their brief exchange. As she sat in silence, a thought began to take shape in her mind. It wasn't enough, she realized, to let these moments pass by. If she truly wanted to bridge the divide, maybe she needed to be the one to take the next step, to help people like him understand her world a little better. Perhaps that was why these encounters left her feeling uneasy, because she always walked away without addressing the bigger issue beneath the surface. Without fully realizing it, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notebook and a pen. She opened it to a blank page, staring down at the empty lines, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. She took a deep breath, letting her mind settle, then began to write. "Dear Sir," she started, the words feeling formal yet appropriate. She paused, thinking carefully, wanting to choose her words with precision and honesty. This wasn't about anger or resentment. It was about trying to create understanding where it was lacking. Emma wrote about her reasons for serving, how her father and her grandfather before him had served in the military, instilling a strong sense of duty and patriotism in her from a young age. She described the deep pride she felt wearing her uniform, not only as a Carter but as a representative of her country. She continued, detailing some of her experiences overseas, though she kept them brief, not wanting to sound self-important or dramatic. She wrote about the friends she had made, people from all walks of life who had become her second family. She described moments of laughter amid the chaos, and how those small moments of joy were sometimes all they had to hold on to. Emma felt a surge of emotion as she remembered the night she and Sergeant Torres had found themselves caught in enemy crossfire. She described, in a few words, how Torres had saved her life that night and how that experience had forever bonded them. She hoped that the man might read her words and understand that when he looked at her uniform, he wasn't just seeing one person. He was seeing a lifetime of sacrifice and service from countless others like her. The more she wrote, the more the words seemed to flow, each sentence a release of the weight she had carried. This wasn't just for him. It was for her, too, a way to process and share parts of herself that most people never asked about. And perhaps it was a way to bridge a divide, one person at a time. By the time she reached the end of the letter, Emma felt a sense of relief. She signed it, respectfully, Lieutenant Emma Carter. Then, carefully, she folded the paper and slipped it into an envelope she had borrowed from a flight attendant earlier. As she sat back, she noticed that the man was watching her from across the aisle, his expression a mixture of curiosity and unease. She met his gaze, her eyes calm but resolute. Tomorrow, she would hand him the letter. It was a small step, but perhaps it would be enough to start breaking down the walls between them. The plane sailed on through the quiet night sky, and Emma felt, for the first time since boarding, a true sense of peace. She had taken a small but meaningful step forward, and whatever happened next, she knew she would be ready to face it with courage and grace. As Emma sat back in her seat, waiting for the right moment to pass the letter to the man, her thoughts drifted to the earliest days of her military career. Before she had become Lieutenant Emma Carter, before deployments, missions, and service, she had been a nervous recruit, young, uncertain, and scared. Basic training had been a relentless whirlwind of challenges. She had been thrown into a world completely foreign to her. Strict discipline, grueling exercises, and rules she had never encountered before. Emma remembered her first morning vividly. The piercing scream of the drill sergeant's whistle, the rough feel of her standard-issue boots as she hurried into formation, and the relentless demands of the day. Her squad had been a mixed group, each person coming from a different background. There was Thomas, a quiet, determined kid from a small town in Kentucky, Aisha, a fierce New Yorker who had been determined to prove she could keep up with anyone, and Benitez, a former college athlete whose natural leadership qualities had shown through from the start. They had all been strangers at first, each of them on their own individual journey. But in the span of a few short weeks, they had become a unit, a family. Emma could still hear the echo of their footsteps as they ran together through morning drills, the crisp, shared rhythm of their movements uniting them. When someone fell behind, the others slowed down. When one of them struggled, the others gave encouragement. It didn't matter where they came from, what color they were, or what beliefs they held. In the end, they shared the same sweat, pain, and determination. They were training to protect something greater than themselves, a purpose that was shared and transcended their differences. During one particularly difficult training session, they had been tasked with carrying heavy sandbags up a steep hill in record time. About halfway up, Aisha had twisted her ankle, collapsing onto the ground with a cry of pain. Without a second thought, Thomas had grabbed one of her sandbags, and Emma had helped her to her feet, each of them supporting her as they made their way up the hill. They hadn't made the time goal that day, but they had finished together, bonded by their shared resolve. It was in those moments that Emma had learned what true teamwork meant. She had realized that the values drilled into them, respect, loyalty, courage, weren't just words. They were lifelines, guiding them through every challenge and every victory. As Emma reflected on those early memories, she realized that this was part of what she wanted the man on the plane to understand. Her uniform represented a shared journey, a commitment to serve not just herself but everyone around her. It represented a family that welcomed anyone willing to take on the challenge, to serve and protect, to set aside personal differences for the greater good. With her letter in hand, Emma resolved that she would share those experiences and try, as best as she could, to bridge the gap between them. She wanted him to know that what he saw as just a uniform carried countless stories and sacrifices within its seams. Emma's memories moved forward to her most recent deployment, to the desert landscape that had become both her workplace and a second home over the past year. She thought about the long days, the intense heat, and the sense of isolation that sometimes felt overwhelming. But she also remembered the deep camaraderie, the way her squad had been bound together in an unspoken trust. They had been family to each other in a way that went beyond blood, family born of shared danger and resilience. A specific memory rose to the surface, one that still sent a chill down her spine. It had been late one night, just before sunrise, when her squad was ambushed during a convoy mission. The sounds of gunfire had shattered the silence, sending everyone scrambling for cover. Emma had quickly assessed her surroundings, her training kicking in automatically. She took position behind a damaged vehicle, ready to return fire, her senses heightened and sharp. As she steadied herself, she heard a cry from the other side of the convoy. It was Sergeant Torres, Elena Torres, her closest friend and confidant. Torres had been pinned down behind a sandbank, unable to move as gunfire rained around her. Without thinking, Emma had dashed across the open ground, bullets whizzing by as she made her way to her friend's side. Together, they had fought back, covering each other until the ambush was under control. In that intense, harrowing moment, Emma hadn't thought about anything but getting her friend to safety. They had trusted each other with their lives, and that trust had carried them through. Afterward, sitting together in the silence of dawn, Emma had looked at Torres and realized just how deeply their shared experiences had bonded them. She had witnessed the same fierce loyalty in every member of her squad. No one cared where anyone else was from, what they looked like, or what they believed in. When it came down to it, all that mattered was the strength of their commitment to each other. Emma hoped the man on the plane would understand that too. She wanted him to see that the values she upheld weren't superficial. They were embedded in the core of her being, woven through every mission and every day of service. The letter she had written was a small window into that world, a way for her to share the things she couldn't express in a simple conversation. As she finished reflecting, she glanced over at the man, who had returned to his seat but still cast glances in her direction. She could see the beginnings of curiosity in his gaze, a shift in his posture that suggested he was re-evaluating his assumptions. Emma was still holding the letter when the flight attendant returned to her row, quietly asking if she needed anything. Emma hesitated, then nodded toward the man across the aisle. "Actually," she said, her voice low, "could you do me a favor? Would you mind passing this to the gentleman across from me? It's a letter I'd like him to read." The flight attendant glanced at the letter, then nodded with a knowing smile. "Of course, Lieutenant." Emma watched as the flight attendant approached the man, handing him the folded envelope. He took it, his expression shifting to one of confusion as he turned it over in his hands. After a moment, he glanced back at Emma, his gaze questioning, almost wary. She offered him a brief nod, encouraging him to open it. Slowly, the man unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the first few lines. Emma watched him, wondering if he would put it aside, dismiss it, or truly read it with an open mind. To her relief, he settled into his seat and continued reading, his expression shifting as he moved through each line. His face softened, his brow furrowing slightly, as if he were absorbing her words more deeply than she had expected. After a few minutes, he looked up, catching her eye. There was a pause, a quiet moment between them as he held her gaze. Emma could see something different in his expression, a glimpse of understanding, perhaps, or at least the start of it. He set the letter down, clearing his throat, and leaned across the aisle. "Lieutenant Carter, thank you," he said, his voice softer, lacking the sharpness from before. "I didn't realize. I hadn't considered." Emma gave him a small nod, her tone gentle. "I understand. A lot of people don't realize. But I wanted you to know why this uniform means so much to me. It's not just clothing. It's a commitment to something bigger than myself." The man's face softened further. "I've lost family to war," he said quietly, his gaze drifting to the seat in front of him. "My younger brother served. He didn't come back." His voice wavered, and he took a breath, steadying himself. "I think I've held on to a lot of anger since then. Anger at the world, anger at, well, I'm not sure at what. But I never expected to see that kind of sacrifice here, on this plane." Emma felt a surge of empathy for him. His anger and resentment made sense now. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. "It's a pain that never really goes away, does it?" The man shook his head, his eyes misting over. "No, it doesn't. And I think maybe that's why I acted the way I did. I've been carrying this bitterness around for years. I let it cloud my judgment." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken emotions filling the space between them. Emma took a deep breath, feeling an unexpected connection with him, a bond born not from shared beliefs but shared pain. "It's never too late to see things differently," Emma said quietly. "Maybe your brother's memory can be a source of peace instead of pain. There's so much good we can do in this world if we let go of bitterness." The man nodded slowly, as if taking her words to heart. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Lieutenant Carter, for the letter, and for helping me see things more clearly." Emma felt a sense of closure settle over her, a quiet satisfaction that went beyond words. She had reached him, even if only in a small way. And in that moment, she realized that her service wasn't just about protecting her country. It was also about bridging divides, fostering understanding, and bringing a little more compassion into the world. As she leaned back in her seat, watching the clouds drift past, she felt a profound sense of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she would continue to serve, not just in uniform but in the way she carried herself, in the small acts of kindness that could change a life. The plane had grown quiet as the passengers settled back into their seats, the initial bustle replaced by the calm rhythm of mid-flight. Emma glanced at the man across the aisle, noticing the change in his posture. Less rigid, more contemplative, as if the letter had unraveled something inside him. She hadn't expected an immediate transformation, but there was a softness in his expression now that hadn't been there before. After a few minutes, he turned to her, clearing his throat. "Lieutenant Carter," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, the tone tentative yet sincere. "I just wanted to apologize for earlier." Emma looked over, surprised. His gaze was fixed on his hands, his fingers twisting his wedding ring, his brows furrowed in what appeared to be genuine regret. "I acted out of line. There's no excuse for it," he continued, his voice raw, stripped of the cold edge he'd displayed earlier. "I assumed things I had no right to assume. And I'm sorry. I was wrong." Emma nodded, offering him a small, forgiving smile. "I appreciate that, sir. Thank you for saying it." He looked up, meeting her gaze, and for a moment, they shared a quiet understanding. She could see the weight he carried, a heaviness that went beyond their encounter today. Emma could sense there was more he wanted to say, but she waited, letting him gather his thoughts. The man took a shaky breath. "I lost my younger brother in Afghanistan 2 years ago," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "He was my family's pride and joy, and he never came home." Emma's heart tightened. She understood that kind of pain, having seen it in the families of her fellow soldiers who hadn't made it back. Losing a loved one in service was a loss that didn't fade with time. It etched itself into a person, shaping every day that followed. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said gently. "It's not something you can ever fully heal from." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls. "I think I've spent the past 2 years blaming everyone and everything. I didn't realize how much bitterness I was carrying. I suppose I thought seeing someone in uniform might bring some kind of comfort. But instead, it just stirred up all that anger." Emma's expression softened. "It's normal to feel that way. When you lose someone, especially in the line of duty, it can leave you with so many unanswered questions. Sometimes we blame others to cope." The man looked down, exhaling heavily. "Maybe," he murmured, "but it's not right. My brother wouldn't have wanted that. He believed in the values of service, in respecting everyone's choices. I lost sight of that, and today, I took that out on you." Emma could see the pain etched into his features, the grief and regret mingling in his eyes. She reached out, placing a reassuring hand on the edge of his seat. "It takes courage to face that kind of pain," she said quietly, "and it takes even more to admit when we're wrong." For the first time since they'd boarded, the man smiled, albeit faintly. "Thank you, Lieutenant, for your patience, and for that letter. I think I needed to hear those words more than I realized." Emma felt a surge of relief, a sense that perhaps, even in a small way, she had helped him begin a path to healing. She nodded, offering him a gentle smile. "Anytime." The conversation that followed felt different, deeper, more genuine, unburdened by the hostility that had tainted their first exchange. They spoke quietly, their voices blending with the gentle hum of the plane, their dialogue now marked by a mutual respect. The man introduced himself as David Walters. He was an executive at a finance firm, he explained, his work life a far cry from Emma's world of service and sacrifice. Emma noticed the regret that lingered in his voice as he shared that his late brother, Jack, had been his closest friend. He spoke of their childhood, the memories of laughter and sibling rivalry, and how he'd been proud but terrified when Jack announced his decision to enlist. Emma listened intently, nodding as he spoke, the details of Jack's life painting a vivid picture in her mind. Jack had been an athlete, a natural leader, and an eternal optimist. He had believed in service, in the honor of protecting others, a value that had driven him to enlist right out of college. When Jack had shipped out, David had feared for him, but he hadn't tried to stop him. "He was determined," David said softly, his voice filled with quiet pride. "He wanted to make a difference." Emma shared her own stories, carefully choosing her words to show David the humanity behind the uniform, the moments of vulnerability and resilience that made up military life. She told him about her best friend, Torres, and how the two of them had leaned on each other through the toughest times. She spoke about the diversity in her squad, how people from every background and belief system had come together, united by a shared mission and mutual respect. David listened with genuine interest, his expression softening with each story. He nodded thoughtfully, as if each piece of Emma's story peeled away another layer of his own pain and resentment. They spoke for what felt like hours, their conversation bridging a divide that had once seemed insurmountable. Emma felt a sense of relief. This was what she had hoped for when she had written the letter, a chance to be seen, to be understood, and to offer understanding in return. As their conversation drew to a close, David looked at her with a newfound respect. "Thank you, Emma," he said quietly, using her first name for the first time. "I don't think I'll ever forget this flight." Emma smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Neither will I," she replied. The hours passed quickly, and soon the announcement came that they would be preparing for descent. Emma gazed out the window as the patchwork landscape of the city below came into view, the vast, twinkling lights of Boston shining up at them. Her heart swelled with anticipation. She was finally home. But as she looked down, she felt something else too, an unexpected sense of purpose, a new path forming in her mind. Her conversation with David had opened her eyes to something that had been stirring inside her for some time now. She had always thought of her role as a soldier solely in terms of deployment and duty, but perhaps her mission could extend beyond that. There were people like David everywhere, civilians who couldn't quite grasp the experiences of those in uniform, families left broken by grief, communities divided by misunderstanding. Perhaps her role could be more than just serving abroad. Perhaps it could involve bridging those divides here at home. She thought about the potential of creating a space where veterans and civilians could come together, where stories could be shared, where healing could happen. Her mind filled with possibilities. A community center, perhaps, or a support group, where people like David could meet people like her, learn from one another, and build connections that could foster understanding. David noticed her thoughtful expression and raised an eyebrow. "You look like you're planning something big," he commented with a smile. Emma chuckled. "I think maybe I am," she admitted, glancing over at him. "Talking with you has given me an idea. I think there's a way to help more people understand what soldiers go through, to bridge the gap between the military and civilians." David nodded, clearly impressed. "I think that's a fantastic idea. There's so much people don't know." "I certainly didn't." Emma felt a surge of determination. "Then maybe it's time I do something about it." They exchanged one last, genuine smile as the plane began its descent, both of them feeling lighter, their burdens eased. David's grief, once a hardened bitterness, had softened, replaced with a sense of clarity and respect. And Emma's purpose had expanded, shifting from personal service to a broader mission of connection. As the plane touched down, Emma felt an immense gratitude, not only for the journey but for the transformation it had inspired. She had entered the plane as a soldier, carrying her duty with quiet pride. But she was leaving it with a vision, a new purpose that would drive her long after she had taken off her uniform. The flight had given her more than just a journey home. It had given her the start of something much greater, an idea that, in its own way, could be a continuation of her service, a way to bring people together and create a deeper, lasting impact. As they taxied to the gate, David turned to her one last time, extending his hand. "Thank you, Emma. Truly." She shook his hand, feeling the sincerity in his grip. "Thank you, David. And don't hesitate to reach out if you ever need someone to talk to." With a final nod, they parted ways, each stepping into the next chapter of their lives. Emma felt a deep sense of peace and purpose, knowing that her journey was only beginning, and that the path ahead was one she was ready to face with an open heart and a steadfast resolve. As Emma stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, she was immediately swept up in a wave of emotions. The familiar sounds of home, people calling out to loved ones, children's laughter, the soft echo of luggage wheels, surrounded her, and she felt the months of tension and weariness start to melt away. She scanned the crowd, her heart racing, until her eyes landed on a small group holding a colorful, handmade sign. "Welcome home, Emma." It was decorated with glitter and tiny American flags, just as she had imagined. Her mother spotted her first, her face lighting up with pure joy. She rushed toward Emma, arms outstretched, and Emma barely had time to drop her bag before she was pulled into a warm, tearful embrace. Her father and younger sister soon joined, wrapping their arms around her in a family hug, the tight circle grounding her as she inhaled the familiar scent of home. "Oh, my baby girl," her mother whispered, holding her as if she might disappear. "We missed you so much." Emma felt her own tears welling up, the emotions of the past months finally finding release. "I missed you all too," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "More than I can say." Her father squeezed her shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. "You're home now. That's all that matters." Her younger sister, Lucy, grinned up at her, her eyes bright with admiration. "I made the sign," she announced proudly, and Emma couldn't help but laugh. "It's perfect, Lucy. Thank you." As they made their way toward the exit, Emma felt a renewed sense of gratitude for her family, for the love that had sustained her through the toughest moments overseas. And yet, in the back of her mind, the ideas she discussed with David lingered, sparking an excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew there was something more she was meant to do. Emma's first day back at home was both familiar and strange. The comfort of her childhood bedroom, the smell of her mom's cooking, and the sound of her sister's laughter in the next room all felt like pieces of a world she'd almost forgotten. She spent the morning sharing stories from her deployment, edited to spare her family the worst of it, and catching up on everything she had missed at home. At breakfast, her father brought up a question that had been on her mind as well. "So, Em, have you thought about what's next?" he asked, trying to sound casual but clearly invested in her answer. Emma paused, glancing around the table at her family's expectant faces. "Actually, I have," she said, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. She hadn't planned to share her new ideas just yet, but the moment felt right. "I've been thinking about starting something for veterans and civilians, a place where people can come together, share stories, and understand each other better," she explained. "There are so many people who don't really understand what military life is like, and I think bridging that gap could help veterans, families, and communities heal and connect." Her mother's eyes filled with pride. "That sounds wonderful, Emma. There's so much people don't know, don't see. This could really make a difference." Her father nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It won't be easy, but you've got our support. Whatever you need." Emma felt her resolve strengthen, knowing her family was behind her. This idea wasn't just a passing thought. It was her next mission. Over the next few days, as Emma settled back into civilian life, she couldn't stop thinking about her encounter with David on the flight. It had left a lasting impression, shaping the vision she had for her future. She thought about how much pain, confusion, and misunderstanding could be eased if people simply took the time to connect, to listen. She reached out to David, sending him a brief message thanking him for the conversation and sharing her plan to create a support network. His response was immediate and enthusiastic. He offered not only words of encouragement, but also his willingness to help in any way he could. The shared connection they had formed over their shared experiences and the letter was the foundation she wanted to build on, one that could inspire others to bridge divides as well. Inspired by their exchange, Emma decided to focus her efforts on creating a community space, something she had dreamed about while still overseas. It would be a space for both veterans and civilians, a place where everyone could come together, learn from each other, and honor the stories of those who had served. As Emma's idea took shape, she began reaching out to local organizations, community leaders, and other veterans who might be interested in joining her cause. She was amazed at the response. Several veterans she spoke with immediately resonated with the idea, expressing how much they wished such a place had existed for them when they returned home. Civilians, too, responded positively, voicing curiosity and a desire to learn more about the military world they knew so little about. With the support of the community, Emma started to organize the first meeting. She chose a modest venue, a community center that had donated space for free, and began spreading the word. She called the group Bridging Lives, a name that captured the essence of her mission. Flyers were posted, social media accounts were created, and soon, the small project she had envisioned on the plane was coming to life. David offered to help with funding, insisting that he wanted to honor his brother's legacy in a way that would bring people together rather than drive them apart. Emma accepted his offer gratefully, touched by his transformation. She saw his involvement as proof that change was possible, that empathy could overcome even the deepest-seated pain. As the date of the first meeting approached, Emma felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. She had led missions and teams overseas, but this felt different. This was personal. This was about bringing her two worlds together in a way that could inspire healing and understanding. On the day of the first Bridging Lives meeting, Emma arrived early at the community center, setting up chairs, arranging refreshments, and organizing the space to feel welcoming. Her family arrived soon after, each of them taking on small tasks, their presence a calming reassurance. She took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of what she was about to start. This wasn't just an event. It was the beginning of something she hoped would ripple outward, touching lives and creating lasting change. As people began to arrive, Emma greeted them, her heart swelling as she saw familiar and new faces alike. A few local veterans, dressed in casual clothes but with an unmistakable military bearing, nodded at her in silent solidarity. Civilians of all ages filed in, some hesitant but curious, others chatting excitedly about what the evening might hold. To her surprise, David walked in just before the event began. He approached her with a warm smile and a look of pride. "Emma," he said, shaking her hand firmly, "this is extraordinary. Thank you for letting me be a part of it." Emma smiled, genuinely touched. "Thank you for believing in this, David. I couldn't have done it without you." As the room filled, Emma took a deep breath, stepping up to the front to begin. She looked out at the audience, the diverse group of faces gazing back at her, each one carrying their own story, their own hopes and questions. For a moment, nerves fluttered in her stomach. But then she remembered why she was here and what had driven her to start this. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady and filled with purpose. "My name is Emma Carter, and I'm here today because I believe in the power of connection. I believe that by sharing our stories, we can bridge the gaps that sometimes divide us. Tonight is just the beginning, but I hope it's the start of something meaningful for each of us." She saw nods in the audience, and even a few smiles of encouragement. Emma continued, sharing her vision for bridging lives and explaining how her experiences in the military had shown her the strength of unity, regardless of background or belief. She spoke about the importance of empathy, of listening to understand rather than judge, and how powerful it could be to connect over shared values. As she spoke, she felt her confidence grow. Her voice grew stronger, her words flowing with the passion she felt in her heart. She looked out at the crowd, feeling a sense of gratitude and pride, knowing that this moment was the culmination of everything she had been through, from her deployment to that fateful flight. When she finished, there was a brief, profound silence. Then, the room erupted in applause, and Emma felt tears prick at her eyes. This was the moment she had dreamed of, the beginning of her next mission. In the hours that followed, veterans and civilians exchanged stories, some laughing, some wiping away tears. Emma moved through the crowd, listening, sharing, encouraging others to open up. She watched as connections were formed, as strangers became friends, and as a community began to take shape. By the end of the evening, Emma felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey that had started on a plane had brought her here, to this room, surrounded by people who were ready to learn, to understand, and to build a better, more compassionate world. As the last few people said their goodbyes and filed out, Emma stood in the empty room, her heart full, her spirit renewed. She knew there was a long road ahead, with challenges and setbacks, but she was ready for it. This was her mission now, a mission of connection, compassion, and lasting change. And as she turned off the lights and closed the door behind her, she knew this was just the beginning. In the days following the first Bridging Lives meeting, Emma found herself filled with a newfound energy and purpose. The response from the community had been overwhelmingly positive. Attendees were already asking about the next event, expressing how impactful it had been to hear stories from both veterans and civilians. The success of that evening had affirmed Emma's vision, but it had also left her thinking about how to expand the project, to reach even more people and foster even deeper understanding. Emma started by reaching out to local high schools and universities, places where she believed students could benefit from exposure to real stories of service and sacrifice. Many young people only knew about the military through news headlines or movies, but Emma wanted to show them the human side of service, the bonds, the challenges, the lessons that came from serving with people from every walk of life. Her first call was to Northview High School, her alma mater. She explained her idea to the principal, outlining a plan to host a session where veterans could share their stories and answer questions from students. To her delight, the principal was enthusiastic, offering to host the event and connect Emma with the student body president to help with promotion. A few days later, Emma found herself standing in front of a packed auditorium, facing rows of curious, bright-eyed students. The principal introduced her warmly, and as Emma took the microphone, she felt a rush of both nerves and excitement. It was one thing to speak to adults, but reaching younger audiences felt like a different kind of responsibility. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady but warm. "My name is Emma Carter, and I'm here today to talk to you about what it's like to serve. But more than that, I'm here to help us understand each other a little better, to bridge the gap between those who serve and those who stay behind." Emma shared stories from her time overseas, her voice filled with sincerity as she described the challenges and joys of military life. She spoke about camaraderie, the moments of strength found in unexpected places, and the sacrifices her friends had made. The students listened intently, their expressions ranging from awe to empathy. Emma could tell she was reaching them, helping them see beyond the uniform to the people who wore it. After her talk, students eagerly raised their hands to ask questions. Some wanted to know why she had chosen to serve, while others asked about the hardest part of her deployment. Emma answered each question with honesty, feeling a sense of pride as she shared her journey. She saw the spark of curiosity and understanding in their eyes, and it filled her with hope. As the event wrapped up, the student body president approached her with a big smile. "This was incredible," she said. "I think a lot of us didn't really understand what service was about until now. Thank you, Lieutenant Carter." Emma smiled back, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you for listening. That's where understanding begins." She left the school that day with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that each story shared, each conversation started, was a step toward a more compassionate, connected world. Word of Emma's initiative spread quickly. Other schools reached out, interested in hosting similar events. Soon, local businesses and community organizations wanted to get involved, offering space and resources for future Bridging Lives meetings. Emma was amazed at how quickly the project was expanding. What had started as a small support group was now growing into a movement of understanding and empathy. Emma realized that the need for connection went far beyond her own community. She began to think about how Bridging Lives could extend beyond Boston, reaching people in other cities and even across the country. She reached out to fellow veterans she had served with, many of whom lived in other states, and shared her vision with them. Some expressed interest in starting their own chapters, excited by the idea of creating spaces for veterans and civilians to connect in their hometowns. One day, Emma received a call from David, who had become one of her most loyal supporters. Since their chance meeting on the plane, David had attended every Bridging Lives event, even volunteering to help with logistics and setup. His involvement had become a way for him to honor his brother's memory, and Emma had come to see him as both a friend and an invaluable partner. "Emma," he said, his tone brimming with excitement, "I just spoke with the CEO of my company, and he's interested in sponsoring Bridging Lives. He's offering to fund additional events, and he's even talking about hosting a gala to raise awareness. I think this could really help us reach more people." Emma's heart leapt. "David, that's incredible. I can't thank you enough for everything you're doing." He laughed softly. "No, thank you, Emma. This has given me a purpose I didn't even know I needed. I think Jack would be proud of this." Emma was deeply moved, knowing how far David had come since their first encounter. His transformation, his willingness to channel his grief into something meaningful, reminded her of the power of connection and empathy. This wasn't just her mission anymore. It had become a shared vision, one that David, and many others, now believed in. With David's company on board, Emma was able to bring Bridging Lives to new locations, reaching veterans and civilians in cities she had never imagined. Each event brought more stories, more voices, and more understanding. And with each gathering, Emma felt the impact of her work deepening, a quiet but powerful ripple spreading outward. As Bridging Lives continued to grow, Emma found herself at a crossroads. Her mission had become so much more than she had anticipated. It was now a full-time commitment, a movement that demanded her attention and dedication. And yet, a part of her still felt the call of military service, the desire to continue protecting and serving her country on a more direct level. She knew she couldn't do both forever. At some point, she would have to choose. One evening, as she sat with her family around the dinner table, she voiced her thoughts aloud. "I feel like I'm being pulled in two directions," she admitted, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I love this work, but part of me still feels like I belong in the field, in uniform." Her father nodded, understanding her conflict. "You've done so much already, Emma. You've served your country, and now you're serving your community. But only you can decide where you're needed most." Her mother reached over, squeezing her hand. "Whatever you choose, we'll support you. We're so proud of you, no matter what." Emma spent the following days wrestling with her decision, weighing the responsibility she felt to her country against the impact she was already making at home. She thought back to the stories she had heard from the veterans she'd met, the way they had opened up in her sessions, sharing experiences that had weighed heavily on their hearts for years. She thought of the civilians who had left her events with a newfound respect and understanding, their misconceptions replaced with empathy. One evening, Emma received a letter from a young man who had attended a recent Bridging Lives session. He was a college student who had lost his uncle, a veteran, to PTSD. In the letter, he thanked Emma for creating a space that had allowed him to understand his uncle's struggles in a way he never had before. He wrote about the peace he had found in finally being able to make sense of his uncle's pain, and how he now felt a deeper connection to him, even in his absence. Reading the letter, Emma felt a wave of emotion. She knew in that moment what her path had to be. Her place was here, building bridges, creating spaces where people could find healing and understanding. She could see now that her mission didn't require a uniform. It required compassion, dedication, and a willingness to serve in a new way. With her decision made, Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She was ready to fully embrace Bridging Lives, to expand it into something even greater. She would dedicate herself to building a legacy of empathy and connection, one that would continue long after she was gone. Emma met with David the next day, sharing her decision. He listened, his expression one of admiration and support. "I'm proud of you, Emma," he said. "You're building something that will change lives. And whatever you need, I'm here to help make it happen." They shook hands, a quiet understanding passing between them. Emma knew she couldn't have come this far alone, and with David's support, she felt ready to take Bridging Lives to new heights. That night, as she lay in bed, Emma thought about all the people she had met, all the lives she had touched, and all the work still left to do. She knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. She was exactly where she needed to be, fulfilling a purpose that went beyond herself. Her path was clear, her mission defined, and as she closed her eyes, she felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that this was only the beginning of the legacy she was destined to build. Months passed, and Bridging Lives continued to grow. Emma's community support group had evolved into a full-fledged organization, with events being held across multiple cities. Emma was busier than ever, traveling to new locations, meeting with volunteers, and organizing sessions. With the help of David's company and a team of dedicated veterans and civilians, Bridging Lives had become a movement, reaching people in ways Emma hadn't dared to dream when she'd started. The culmination of this growth was an invitation to speak at the annual Veterans and Families Conference in Washington, D.C. The conference was a major event, attended by military officials, advocates, and leaders from across the country. Emma had been offered a keynote slot to talk about her journey, her mission, and the impact Bridging Lives had made. The invitation felt surreal, and yet she knew it was an incredible opportunity to share her story and inspire others. As Emma took the stage that day, she looked out at the sea of faces, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, all of them watching her with an intensity that sent a thrill of nerves through her. She took a deep breath, grounding herself in the mission that had brought her here. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "My name is Emma Carter, and I'm here to talk about bridges. Not the kind that span rivers or highways, but the kind that connect hearts and minds." A hush fell over the audience, their attention captured by the quiet strength in her words. Emma continued, recounting her experience in the military, the people she had served alongside, and the lessons she had learned about unity and respect. She spoke about the pain of coming home to a world that didn't fully understand the sacrifices made by soldiers and the struggles they faced after returning. She shared the story of her fateful encounter with David on the plane, describing how that moment of conflict had evolved into a deep connection and a shared mission. "When I sat down in that seat on the plane, I didn't know I'd end up starting a movement," Emma said, her voice filled with emotion. "But that interaction changed my life, and it taught me something powerful. That understanding and healing start with empathy, with listening." Emma glanced out at the audience, noting the nods, the thoughtful expressions. She felt a surge of encouragement and pressed on, describing how Bridging Lives had transformed people, how it had allowed veterans and civilians to see each other with new eyes. She spoke about the young people she'd met, the veterans who had finally felt heard, and the families who had found comfort in the shared stories of others. When she finished, there was a pause, a moment of profound silence. Then, the room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that left Emma overwhelmed with gratitude and pride. She had reached them, had made them feel what she felt, and she knew that each person in that room was leaving with a piece of Bridging Lives in their heart. As she stepped off the stage, David greeted her with a huge smile, his eyes filled with pride. "Emma, that was incredible," he said, pulling her into a hug. "You've inspired every person in that room." Emma hugged him back, a sense of accomplishment washing over her. "Thank you, David. I couldn't have done it without you." After the speech, Emma found herself approached by several people eager to learn more about Bridging Lives. One of them was Karen Liu, the director of a nonprofit organization that worked with military families struggling to adapt to civilian life. She was a petite, sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, with an air of warmth and determination that Emma found instantly appealing. "Emma, I loved your speech," Karen said, shaking her hand. "I think our organizations could do amazing work together. We focus on family support, and what you're doing with Bridging Lives could really complement that." Emma's interest was piqued. She'd always wanted to expand Bridging Lives to include more support for families, understanding that the struggles veterans faced often extended to their loved ones. "I'd love to work together," Emma replied, smiling warmly. "I think our missions are aligned. Families need support just as much as the veterans themselves." Over coffee, Emma and Karen discussed ways they could collaborate, brainstorming programs that would bring families into the conversations and support networks Bridging Lives was building. Karen shared her own story, describing how her husband, a former Marine, had struggled after his return, leaving her feeling isolated and unable to help him. It was what had driven her to start her nonprofit, to ensure other families wouldn't have to navigate the journey alone. Emma felt a deep connection with Karen, inspired by her resilience and commitment to service. They agreed to organize a joint event, a family workshop that would bring together veterans, their loved ones, and civilian supporters. Emma knew that Karen's insight and experience would bring a new dimension to Bridging Lives, making it stronger and more inclusive. The friendship blossomed quickly. Karen became not only a trusted partner but a confidant, someone Emma could turn to for advice and support as the organization continued to grow. Together, they crafted plans for workshops, family retreats, and outreach programs, envisioning a network that would support veterans and families alike. Emma felt grateful to have found a kindred spirit in Karen. She knew that with allies like her, Bridging Lives could reach even greater heights, touching lives in ways she hadn't thought possible. As Bridging Lives expanded, Emma began to consider new ways to reach people beyond her immediate community. She dreamed of establishing a headquarters, a place where people could gather for workshops, counseling, and support all year round. She imagined it as a space filled with light, warmth, and a sense of peace, a refuge where veterans and civilians alike could connect, heal, and grow. With David's and Karen's support, Emma began the process of securing funding for a permanent center. They held fundraisers, reaching out to local businesses, philanthropists, and even government officials who believed in their mission. The momentum grew, and soon, they had enough to start looking for a property that could serve as the heart of Bridging Lives. Emma's vision extended beyond just one center, however. She dreamed of setting up chapters in different cities, creating a network of support that would allow veterans and civilians across the country to connect and share their stories. She envisioned training local leaders, veterans who had participated in bridging lives, to lead their own chapters, empowering them to carry the mission forward. One afternoon, Emma sat with David and Karen in the nearly empty building they had just leased for the first Bridging Lives Center. It was a spacious, high-ceilinged property with large windows that filled the room with natural light. It needed work, a fresh coat of paint, furniture, and a lot of TLC, but Emma could already see the potential. "This is going to be the start of something incredible," David said, his voice filled with admiration as he looked around the space. "You did this, Emma." Emma shook her head, smiling. "We did this. All of us. This movement is more than just me. It's everyone who believes in the power of connection and compassion." They spent the day envisioning how each room would be used. One area would be a gathering space for group meetings, another a quiet room for individual reflection. There would be a family area, a counseling office, and a large, inviting lobby where guests would be welcomed with warmth and understanding. They painted the walls in calming colors, arranged furniture, and filled the rooms with thoughtful details. Artwork donated by local artists, bookshelves lined with resources on mental health, and spaces that encouraged openness and dialogue. As they worked, Emma felt a profound sense of purpose. She had always known that Bridging Lives was about more than just sharing stories. It was about creating a space where people could feel seen, valued, and understood. And now, standing in the center of this new home, she felt a deep conviction that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The grand opening was set for the following month, and invitations were sent out to veterans, civilians, families, supporters, and anyone who had been a part of Emma's journey. She wanted to celebrate not only the physical space but the community they had all built together. A community born from empathy, resilience, and a desire to make the world a kinder, more connected place. As the final coat of paint dried, Emma stood in the center of the room, taking in the quiet beauty of the space. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that Bridging Lives was no longer just an idea or a project. It was a reality, a movement, and a legacy that would continue to grow. In that moment, Emma felt the presence of all those who had inspired her journey. Her family, her fellow soldiers, David, and even the man her organization was named after, Jack. This was for them. For the ones who had fought, the ones who had struggled, and the ones who were still searching for a bridge between worlds. As she turned to leave, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. This was only the beginning, and with each step forward, Bridging Lives would continue to build bridges, one story, one connection, and one heart at a time. The day of the grand opening arrived, bringing with it a sense of anticipation that buzzed through Emma's entire team. Volunteers, veterans, families, and local supporters all gathered at the new Bridging Lives Center, admiring the space that had come to life through the collective effort of the community. Banners and balloons decorated the entrance, and tables filled with refreshments welcomed guests as they arrived. A large, handwritten sign at the front read, "Welcome to Bridging Lives, where stories create connections." Emma stood at the entrance, greeting guests with a mixture of pride and gratitude. She watched as people from all walks of life walked through the doors, veterans, families, civilians, students, and local leaders. Each person carried their own unique story, and it was this diversity of experiences that made the opening so special. David, who had been instrumental in getting the center off the ground, joined her at the entrance. He looked around, his eyes bright with pride. "Emma, this is incredible. Look at what you've built." Emma smiled, her heart swelling. "We built this, David. This is as much your legacy as it is mine." Just before the official opening ceremony, Karen joined them, her excitement evident as she handed out programs and welcomed guests. "This is amazing, Emma," she said, hugging her tightly. "Thank you for letting me be part of this." Emma squeezed her friend's hand. "I couldn't have done it without you, Karen. This is just the beginning." As the crowd settled, Emma took a deep breath, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement as she prepared to address the audience. She stepped up to the small stage they'd set up in the main room, looking out at the faces of people who had become a part of her journey. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "I want to thank each of you for being here today. This center, Bridging Lives, is more than just a building. It's a place where people can come to be seen, to be heard, and to find connection. It's a place for stories of struggle, resilience, healing, and hope. She paused, glancing around the room. I know many of you have faced hardships, losses, and challenges that are hard to put into words. I started Bridging Lives because I believe that when we share our stories, we create understanding and empathy that can bridge even the widest divides. We all have something to teach each other, something to offer. As she spoke, she saw nods of agreement and even a few tears in the audience. Emma continued, sharing her gratitude for the people who had supported her mission. From David, who had transformed his grief into a powerful legacy, to Karen, who had brought her own unique insight to the organization. She thanked her family, who had supported her from the very beginning, and her fellow veterans, whose bravery and resilience had inspired her every step of the way. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, and Emma felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This center was no longer just a dream. It was a reality, a safe space where people could find the connections they had been searching for. After her speech, the doors officially opened, and guests began exploring the center. Emma watched as people moved through the rooms, some sharing stories, others simply sitting together in quiet reflection. She saw veterans laughing with civilians, families finding comfort in shared experiences, and young people asking questions, eager to learn and understand. The day was filled with warmth and connection, a testament to the vision that had brought Bridging Lives to life. And as the sun set, casting a soft glow over the building, Emma knew this was only the beginning of the impact they would create. As the weeks passed, Bridging Lives became a bustling hub of activity. The center hosted weekly meetings, workshops, and counseling sessions, all designed to foster understanding and support. Veterans and civilians alike found a place where they could speak openly, share their experiences, and find healing in the presence of others who genuinely listened. Emma was there nearly every day, guiding sessions, connecting people, and watching the community flourish. Each week brought new faces, people drawn to the center by word of mouth or curiosity, eager to see what Bridging Lives was about. Emma's heart swelled with pride as she saw her vision continuing to expand, reaching people from all walks of life. One day, a young man named James came to the center, his expression hesitant as he walked through the doors. He was a recent college graduate, and like David, he had lost a sibling in combat. His older brother had been his hero, his inspiration, but his passing had left James grappling with a profound grief he didn't know how to express. Emma greeted him, sensing the heaviness in his eyes. "Welcome, James," she said softly, guiding him to one of the quiet rooms. "Take your time. You're safe here." Over the next few weeks, James became a regular visitor, attending group sessions and slowly opening up about his loss. Emma watched as he connected with other veterans, some of whom had lost comrades or family members of their own. They shared stories, memories, and a quiet understanding that needed no words. James found solace in their presence, and little by little, his grief transformed into something softer, something he could hold without it consuming him. James's journey reminded Emma of the profound impact Bridging Lives was having. This wasn't just a center. It was a family, a place where people could find healing through empathy and connection. It was everything she had hoped for and more. Meanwhile, Karen and David continued to support her with the center's expansion. They organized fundraisers, reached out to other communities, and began training leaders in nearby cities to start Bridging Lives chapters. Emma's dream of building a network across the country was taking shape, with new chapters launching in cities she had never even visited. Emma felt a surge of pride as she watched her team work tirelessly, their shared mission driving them forward. Karen became a trusted leader in her own right, running the family programs and offering guidance to loved ones struggling with the impact of military life. David, too, had found his place, using his skills and resources to secure funding and partnerships that would help Bridging Lives continue to grow. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning, Emma, Karen, and David sat together in the quiet of the center's main room, reflecting on all they had accomplished. "I can't believe how far we've come," Emma said, her voice filled with awe. "This started as a conversation on a plane, and now, look at what it's become." Karen smiled, reaching for her hand. You turned your dream into something real, Emma, and you've given all of us a chance to be a part of it. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. This is more than just a center. It's a legacy. You're changing lives, Emma, and you've changed mine. Emma looked at her friends, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She knew she couldn't have done this alone. Each of them had contributed something vital to the mission, and together, they had built something that would last, a movement of empathy and understanding that would continue long after they were gone. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Emma allowed herself to imagine the future. Centers in every state, veterans and civilians connecting in ways she had only dreamed of, families finding peace, young people learning about service and sacrifice. It was a vision that filled her with hope, and she knew she was ready to continue leading the way. That night, as she closed up the center and walked out into the cool evening air, Emma felt a sense of peace unlike any she had ever known. She was exactly where she was meant to be, fulfilling a mission that had become her life's work. And as she looked back at the glowing lights of the Bridging Lives Center, she knew that this was only the beginning of a legacy that would continue to grow, touching countless lives in ways she could only begin to imagine. With Bridging Lives flourishing beyond her initial dreams, Emma felt a renewed purpose, yet also a quiet, bittersweet feeling. The organization had grown into a national movement with new chapters, more staff, and even greater community support. Each new branch carried Emma's original mission, connecting veterans and civilians through shared stories and empathy, and yet, Emma sensed it was almost time for her to step back. She sat in her office one evening, looking around at the familiar space filled with memories of late-night planning sessions, brainstorming meetings with Karen and David, and heartfelt conversations with veterans and families. She had poured her heart and soul into this organization, but she also knew that she had to make room for the next generation of leaders who would carry Bridging Lives forward. The center had become a family of its own, a self-sustaining network that could thrive even as she moved on. Karen entered the room, sensing Emma's pensive mood. "You're thinking about what's next, aren't you?" she asked, her tone gentle. Emma nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I am. Bridging Lives has become something far bigger than I ever imagined. I feel like it's ready to stand on its own, but part of me wonders what that will look like if I'm not here." Karen smiled knowingly. "You've built something solid, Emma. It's not just a project, it's a legacy. And legacies have lives of their own. They don't end when we step back. They grow because we've given them strong roots." Emma let the words sink in, feeling a wave of gratitude for Karen's steadfast support. Karen was right. Bridging Lives was bigger than any one person. It was a community, a family, a movement grounded in empathy and compassion. "Thank you, Karen," Emma said softly, "for everything. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Karen smiled, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "You were always meant to lead this, Emma, but now it's time to let others step up and carry the torch. And whenever you're ready to pass it on, I'll be here to help." In the following weeks, Emma prepared for her transition, meeting with team members, passing on her knowledge, and preparing her successor. She had handpicked a new leader, a fellow veteran named Daniel, who had been with Bridging Lives since its early days. Daniel understood Emma's vision intimately, and he shared her commitment to creating a space for veterans, civilians, and families alike. Emma felt confident he would carry the mission forward with compassion and dedication. On her last day at the center as its director, Emma gathered her team for a farewell meeting. She looked around the room at the familiar faces who had become her family, each person a piece of the legacy she was leaving behind. "Thank you all," she began, her voice filled with emotion. "I started Bridging Lives because I believe that every person's story has the power to connect us. And because of each of you, that belief has grown into something I never could have imagined. This isn't goodbye, it's simply a new chapter. I'll always be a part of Bridging Lives, no matter where I am." The team applauded, a few wiping away tears, and Emma felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had done her part. The mission would continue, strengthened by the hands and hearts of those who would carry it forward. Months after stepping back, Emma found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She spent her days volunteering, giving guest lectures, and meeting with local veterans and community groups, sharing the lessons she had learned through bridging lives. Her influence remained strong, and she continued to guide others, always with the same mission in mind: to build bridges of understanding and compassion. One autumn evening, Emma was invited to speak at a Bridging Lives event held at a new center in Seattle. It was humbling to see how her original idea had blossomed into a nationwide network, each center carrying on the same mission she had started years ago. When she arrived at the Seattle Center, she saw familiar faces. David and Karen had traveled to support her, along with Daniel and other original team members. As Emma took the stage, she felt the same pride and humility she had felt at that very first meeting. She began her speech, her words laced with the wisdom gained from her journey, her tone filled with gratitude and hope. "When I first began Bridging Lives, I never imagined that it would grow into this," she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But seeing all of you here today, I realize that this has never been about one person or one story. It's about every single person who has taken a step forward to bridge the divide, who has reached out a hand in empathy, who has chosen compassion over judgment." The audience was rapt, listening intently as Emma shared her message. She spoke of the veterans who had found a renewed sense of purpose, the families who had found healing, and the young people who had discovered respect and understanding for service members. "This legacy isn't mine alone," Emma continued, her voice strong. "It belongs to everyone who believes in the power of empathy, who sees value in every story and every life. Bridging Lives will continue to grow, not because of me, but because of each of you." After her speech, Emma spent time speaking with attendees, listening to their stories, feeling the impact her vision had created. She met young people who were inspired to serve, veterans who had found solace and camaraderie, and families who felt connected in ways they hadn't thought possible. Her heart swelled with gratitude, knowing that the legacy of Bridging Lives was secure, growing far beyond what she had once dreamed. As the event wound down, Emma stepped outside into the crisp night air, her gaze lifting to the sky. The stars shone brightly above, vast and endless, reminding her of all the connections she had built, each one a thread woven into the tapestry of her life's work. She felt at peace, knowing that she had fulfilled her purpose, had given everything she could to a cause that was larger than herself. Just then, David and Karen joined her, standing beside her as they looked out over the city lights. "What's next for you, Emma?" Karen asked softly. Emma smiled, her eyes twinkling with quiet resolve. "I think I'll keep sharing stories, meeting people, and maybe planting a few more seeds for change," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "But I know that Bridging Lives will keep growing without me, and that's all I could ever ask for." They stood together, three friends who had become family through a shared journey, their hearts bound by a mission that would continue to touch lives for years to come. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her journey fall away, replaced by a lightness, a hope for the future she had helped create. As she looked out into the night, Emma knew that the world was full of stories waiting to be told, of people waiting to connect, and of bridges waiting to be built. And with every step she took forward, she carried the legacy of Bridging Lives with her, a testament to the power of empathy, resilience, and the simple, extraordinary act of listening. This was her legacy, and she knew it would live on, a quiet but powerful force for change in a world that needed it more than ever.